His name was George Perry Floyd Jr., and he was born on October 14, 1973, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. To his parents, George Floyd Sr. and Larcinia Jones Floyd, Sissy, the matriarch. Now, you met George Floyd's brother, Philonis, and you heard all about Sissy Floyd. She was George Floyd's mom. She was the mom of the house. She was the mom of the neighborhood. And you heard about the special bond that she and George Floyd shared during his life. You heard about their relationship, how he would always take time, special attention to be with his mother, how he would still cuddle with her in the fetal position. You heard that. And from George Floyd's brother, you learned all about George's childhood. And during his time growing up in that house, George Floyd was surrounded by people he knew, people who knew him, people he recognized, a familiar face to pick out in the crowd. People need that. George Floyd was surrounded by people he cared about and who cared about him throughout his life, throughout his childhood in that house, through his adolescence, into his adulthood. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd died, face down on the pavement, right on 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis. Nine minutes and 29 seconds. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. During this time, George Floyd struggled, desperate to breathe, to make enough room in his chest to breathe. But the force was too much. He was trapped. He was trapped with the unyielding pavement underneath him, as unyielding as the men who held him down, pushing him. A knee to the neck, a knee to the back, twisting his fingers, holding his legs for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The defendant's weight on him. The lungs in his chest unable to expand because there wasn't enough room to breathe. George Floyd tried. He pushed his bare shoulder against the pavement to lift himself, to give his chest, to give his lungs enough room in his chest to breathe, with the pavement tearing into his bare skin. As he desperately pushed with his knuckles to make space so he'd have room to breathe, the pavement lacerating his knuckles. The defendant stayed on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So desperate to breathe, he pushed with his face, to lift himself, to open his chest, to give his lungs room to breathe. The pavement tearing into his skin, George Floyd losing strength. Not superhuman strength. There was no superhuman strength that day. There's no superhuman strength because there's no such thing as a superhuman. Those exist in comic books. And 38th in Chicago is a very real place. Not superhumans. Only humans. Just a human, just a man, lying on the pavement, being pressed upon, desperately crying out. A grown man crying out for his mother. A human being. And in that time, and in that place, while he was surrounded in life by people he knew him, faces he could pick out, there was no one there he knew. He was surrounded by strangers. Strangers, all of them. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He's surrounded by strangers, not a familiar face to say his final words. But he did say them to someone. He said them to someone who he did not know by name, but he knew him from the uniform he wore and the badge he wore. And he called him Mr. Officer. That's what he called him, Mr. Officer. Mr. Officer would help. We call the police when we need help. And he pleaded with Mr. Officer. George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant. He asked for help with his very last breath. But Mr. Officer did not help. The defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand, to twist his fingers into the handcuffs that bound him, looking at him, staring down at times the horrified bystanders who had gathered and watched this unfold. The motto of the Minneapolis Police Department is to protect with courage and to serve with compassion. But George Floyd was not a threat to anyone. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He wasn't trying to do anything to anyone. Facing George Floyd that day, that did not require 1 ounce of courage, and none was shown on that day. No courage was required. All that was required was a little compassion. And none was shown on that day. George Floyd said, "I'm not trying to win." This was a call about a counterfeit $20 bill. All that was required was some compassion. Humans need that. People need that. But more fundamental than that, and more practical at that time, in that place, what George Floyd needed was some oxygen. That's what he needed. He needed to breathe. Because people need that. Humans need that. To breathe. And he said that. And the defendant heard him say that. Over and over. He heard him, but he just didn't listen. He continued to push him down, to grind into him, to shimmy, to twist his hand for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He begged, George Floyd begged until he could speak no more, and the defendant continued this assault. When he was unable to speak, the defendant continued. When he was unable to breathe, the defendant continued beyond the point that he had a pulse. Beyond the point that he had a pulse, the defendant continued this assault. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. When the ambulance arrived, the ambulance was here, and the defendant continued. He stayed on top of him. He would not get up. He would not let up. He stayed on him, grinding into him, continuing to twist his fingers, to hold him down. He had no pulse. He was not breathing. He was not responsive, and the defendant had to know what was right beneath him. Right beneath him. You saw the video. You saw the point when the ambulance arrived, and finally, after a paramedic got out, and the defendant still did not get up, and the paramedic tapped him, and finally the defendant got up, and they lifted Mr. Floyd onto that gurney, and you saw the way he was not, there was nothing there. His head had to be held to prevent it from falling to the ground. He was completely limp. The defendant had to know that. He was there. He was on top of him. And he was on top of him. On top of him. Sometimes you ask for the truth, sometimes you insist on the truth. And the truth is the defendant was on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And he had to know. He had to know. The medical examiner would find the cause of George Floyd's death to be cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Well, what you saw the defendant and the other officers doing to George Floyd caused his death. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, death at the hands of another. What the defendant did to George Floyd killed him. It was ruled a homicide. The defendant is charged with murder. He's charged with murder and he's charged with manslaughter. The defendant at the time was a police officer. Okay? It may be hard for any of you to imagine a police officer doing something like this. Remember, in jury selection, and we talked about bias and we talked about setting biases and preconceived notions behind. Well, imagining a police officer committing a crime might be the most difficult thing you have to set aside, because that's just not the way we think of police officers. We trust the police. We trust the police to help us. We believe the police are going to respond to our call for help. We believe they're going to listen to us. And this is strong. This runs deep. I'd say it's difficult to set this aside. I want you to consider that even after, with the bystanders, after they saw what they saw, after they saw this shocking display of abuse of police power and a man murdered in front of them, Genevieve Hansen, she called the police. Donald Williams, he saw this. You heard him. He testified. He called the police. A 9-year-old. Judea. What did she suggest? We need to call the police on the police. That's our expectation. Even after seeing this, even after witnessing this, our expectation is that the police are going to help. And with reason, and with good reason. Right? Because policing is a most noble profession. It is. It is. And to be very clear, this case is called the State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. This case is not called the State of Minnesota versus the police. It is not. Policing is a noble profession, and it is a profession. You met several Minneapolis police officers during this trial. You met them. They took the stand. They testified. Make no mistake, this is not a prosecution of the police. It is a prosecution of the defendant. And there's nothing worse for good police than a bad police who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't follow procedure, who doesn't follow training, who ignores the policies of the department, the motto of the department: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. Chief Arredondo, the chief of police in Minneapolis Police Department, he took the stand and he testified and he told you what that badge that he wears over his heart means. It's a public service. It's a public trust. They're there to help us. It's a professional organization. There are standards. There are rules. There's a code of conduct. There's a use of force policy. There's extensive training. The police are first responders. They're who we call for help, and they help us. They have CPR training. If there's more training than simply use of force. There's more to policing than putting handcuffs on people and hauling them away, to be true. Right? There's other kinds of training. There's procedural justice. There's crisis intervention training. There's medical training. And there's defensive tactics. And there's de-escalation. All of this training. Hundreds of hours of training. You met the people who staff the training center, and they told you, we don't train this. They told you that. The sanctity of life and the protection of the public, those are the cornerstones of the Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy. The protection of the public, all of the human beings that make up the public. The defendant, he didn't do that because that day his badge just wasn't in the right place. The defendant was a police officer. He was. And again, you need to set aside the notion that it's impossible for a police officer to do something like this. The defendant is on trial not for being a police officer. It's not the state versus the police. He's not on trial for who he was. He's on trial for what he did. That is what he did. That is what he did on that day. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That is what he did. He didn't follow training, those hundreds of hours of training that he had. He did not follow the department's use of force rules. He did not perform CPR. He knew better. He just didn't do better. He just didn't do better. Remember during opening statement, counsel said that the defendant followed the rules and followed his training. Did you hear evidence of that? Did you hear evidence of that from the stand? Or did you hear something quite different? The chief of police testified. He violated their use of force policy. He violated their de-escalation policy. He violated the duty to render emergency aid. No. You heard the trainer, Lieutenant Mercil. We don't train this. This is not who we are. No. That representation was simply wrong. That's just a story. What the defendant did was not policing. What the defendant did was an assault. I'm going to discuss the law with you in a bit here and explain. The court's already provided you some instructions on second-degree murder, and you know, done in the laws of this state, if you commit a certain level of assault, a felony level assault, and a person dies as a result of your assault, you're guilty of murder. It's as simple as that. And what the defendant did here was a straight-up felony assault. This was not policing. It was unnecessary. It was gratuitous. It was disproportionate. And he did it on purpose. No question. This was not an accident. He did not trip and fall and find himself upon George Floyd's knee and neck. He did what he did on purpose. And it killed George Floyd. That force for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that killed George Floyd. He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for. It's not how they're trained. It's not following the rules. This is not an anti-police prosecution. It's a pro-police prosecution. The defendant abandoned his values, abandoned the training, and killed a man. And why? right out in the public, right out in broad daylight, in front of several bystanders as they looked in shock and horror. And why? Well, this all started over a call of an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. But George Floyd's life was taken for something worth far, far less. Far less. You saw the photo. You saw the body language. You can learn a lot about someone by looking at their body language. The defendant facing down that crowd. They were pointing cameras at him, recording him, telling him what to do, challenging his authority, his ego, his pride. Not the kind of pride that makes you do better, be better. The kind of ego-based pride. But the defendant was not going to be told what to do. He was not going to let these bystanders tell him what to do. He was going to do what he wanted, how he wanted, for as long as he wanted. And there was nothing they could do about it, because he had the authority. He had the power of the badge and the other officers. And the bystanders were powerless. They were powerless to do a thing. The defendant, he chose pride over policing. Charles McMillan, 61 years old, interesting man. Right? You remember when he testified, he had the glasses. If any of you in the front row, when he walked by, happened to notice his shoes, if you looked at his shoes, you probably saw your reflection in those shoes, right? He dressed for court like it was the most important day of his life. Interesting man. He was there. He's sort of narrating this horrific scene throughout. You hear him in the video. And he called out to George Floyd. He said, "You can't win. You can't win." And George Floyd replied, "I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I'm scared." But the defendant was trying to win. He wasn't going to be told what to do. He wasn't going to take a challenge to his authority. He was trying to win. And George Floyd paid for it with his life. Now, also need to be clear, this is not the trial of George Floyd. George Floyd is not on trial here. You've heard some things about George Floyd, that he struggled with drug addiction, that he was being investigated for allegedly passing a fake $20 bill, that there was never any evidence introduced that he knew was fake in the first place. Right? But he is not on trial. He didn't get a trial when he was alive. And he is not on trial here. Defense claims that he was non-compliant. Non-compliant. Well, let's revisit what happened before the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Before that, it's Memorial Day, right? May 25, 2020, and George Floyd is sitting in a car in the driver's seat with two friends. Now, previously he'd been in Cup Foods. He'd been in the store. He was walking. He was talking. He was breathing. As alive as any person, any human in this room. Back to the car. He's with his friends, and there's a tap at the window. He looks to his left, and is startled. This is what he sees. This is what he sees. Within seconds of the approach, Officer Lane have tapped on the window. Within seconds, he pulls his gun and holds it inches from George Floyd's face and starts shouting profanities. "Show me your effing hands. Show me your effing hands." Screaming it. This is within seconds. You can tell a lot about someone by looking at their body language. How does Mr. Floyd look in this photo? Terrified? an officer on the driver's side, an officer on the passenger side. Lane orders Floyd to put his hands on the steering wheel. He does. That's not resistance, that's compliance. Lane orders Floyd to get out of the car. He does. That's not resistance, that's compliance. They order him, they want him handcuffed. He is handcuffed. That's not resistance, that's compliance. And on the handcuffs, if you recall the testimony, they weren't properly double locked. And so they continue to ratchet. They're not on correctly, they're on too tight. Throughout, and you listen to the videos, throughout the videos you can hear the sound of those handcuffs ratcheting tighter and tighter. Mr. Floyd is trying to explain to the police that his wrists hurt. Impervious of pain. Please. His wrists hurt. No one listens to him. But it continues. They tell him to go over to the Dragon Walk. He goes over to the Dragon Walk. That's not resistance, that's compliance. They ask him to sit down. He sits down. Not resistance, compliance. Not trying to escape, not trying to evade arrest, not trying to assault anybody, shoot anybody, stab anybody, punch anybody. No. Compliance. Sits down on the ground. They ask him his name. He gives his name. He spells it. That's not resistance, that's compliance. They ask him to get up, he gets up. They ask him to go across the street, he goes across the street. Right? Where's the resistance? Where's that? They take him over to the car. Okay? They take him over to the car. George Floyd is a big guy. Right? You can see here, I mean, he's almost as big as Officer Lane. He's a big guy. He's a big person. The back of the squad car is not. Right? That's what they wanted him to get into. And to George Floyd, he looked at that. What do you think that looked like? Like a little cage. Right? He tried to explain himself to the officers that he had anxiety, that he had claustrophobia. He explained this over and over. They wanted him to get in the back of this little car. And you know, he just wasn't able to bring himself to do it. He wasn't able to bring himself to do it.
Man, I'm scared as fuck, man. That's a breather's gonna go off on me, man.
Pull your legs in.
Okay. Let me count to three. Let me count to three and I'm going in. Please.
So he's trying to work up the ability to get in the car. He's explaining himself repeatedly. And you can see this is where the defendant and Officer Tao start coming into the scene. Right? And we'll look at what they saw in a minute. But they start to come to the scene. Right? A 19-year veteran of the police force with all of the training that involves, over 800 hours of training, 40-hour crisis intervention training course, a scenario-based training where they're taught to recognize the signs of someone who is experiencing a crisis. A crisis. You know, he couldn't bring himself to get in, and sometimes people can't bring themselves to get in, and this is not new. This is not groundbreaking. Okay? People have emotions. People have things happen to them. The police train for this. They recognize this. You don't get to meet the police on your best day very often. You don't call the police and say everything's fine, just wanted you to know, right? That doesn't happen. Okay? No, there's a whole range of humanity out there who have a whole range of different issues. I mean, it could be anything. It could be a death in the family. Right? That can cause an extreme emotional response. You know, recall when Officer Lane approached the car, George Floyd talked about losing his mother. He'd lost her in 2018. Those wounds still right there on the surface. Emotion. It could involve a divorce, finding bad financial news, right? Mental illness, mental health issues, like drug and alcohol abuse. all of those things can cause someone to not resist, but just not be able to bring themselves to comply at that moment, at that time. And this is nothing new. They train for it, they plan for it, they prepare for it, they have a policy on it, right? Recognizing persons in crisis. You remember Chief Arredondo took the stand. He testified that they have 4,000 calls for service for persons in crisis every single year. This is nothing new. They're there on a $20 counterfeiting charge. They train for this. They know about this. Now, George Floyd certainly had his struggles. You know that. The state put in evidence of that. Right? Courtney Ross testified that he struggled with an opioid addiction. You knew that. And this is nothing new. The difference, though, on May 25, 2020, the officers just wouldn't listen to him, wouldn't look at the signs, wouldn't recognize the signs of what they had prepared for. And a reasonable officer in the defendant's place, with all his training and all his experience, including that 40-hour crisis intervention course and a subsequent refresher course, should have known that and should have recognized it. Floyd was trying to get into the car. He was trying to work up the courage. He said he'd count to 3. But he just couldn't do it. So the defendant arrives on the scene. He surveys the scene. He saunters up to the car, and he slips on his gloves.
You can't win, bro. You can't win.
I'm not trying to win.
Go on, get in the car.
I'll be on the ground, anything.
Go get in the car.
He know it. He know it too, Mr. Officer. Y'all hear me? Don't do me like that, man. Please. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
Listen, you get in this car, we can talk.
I am claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic, man.
Get in the car. Get in the car.
Get me in the front. Please.
No, you're not in the car.
I'm claustrophobic, Mr. Officer.
Get in the car.
Okay, man, okay? I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy.
You ain't gonna win.
So they don't listen. They just shove him into the car, into that tiny back seat. You saw the look on his face. You saw the look on George Floyd's face when he glanced over into that car. Looked like he'd seen a monster looking into that car. Clearly, this trained officer should have recognized that and understood at that moment and that time, well, what is your goal? Where'd this critical thinking model go? Where'd that go? Where you take in information, you assess the information, you reassess the information, you consider what's the goal, what's the plan. You're there for a $20 counterfeiting charge, allegedly. Chief Arredondo testified they generally don't put people in custody for that. So why is it necessary to shove them in the car? They made a judgment call, they decided to shove them in the car. The predictable thing to happen, happened, right? He just couldn't be in the back of that car. And so they pull him out. They pull him out. And watch what happens. They pull him out of the car. On the ground.
Yeah, on the ground. On the ground.
All right, folks. They get him out of the car. He is handcuffed. He is on his knees. He is not going anywhere. There are 4 officers there. 4 officers. And what did George Floyd say once they pulled him out of the car? Thank you. Thank you. Now, a reasonable officer in the defendant's position at that time should have recognized and understood he wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to punch anyone, stab anyone. No, he wasn't trying to do that. The problem was the back of the car, just like George Floyd tried to explain over and over. The problem was the back of the car. So if you can give them the benefit of the doubt that they made a bad judgment call and shoved him in the back of the car, at least when he came out in the struggle, it was over. He was on his knees. He was saying thank you. Done. No need. It could have been over there. But what did they do? They took him from this position, handcuffed on his knees. They pushed him down onto the ground. Didn't need to. Not at all.